our next speaker will be John Collins. He will speak to us via Zoom. He's the Holmes Professor of Old Testament Criticism and Interpretation Emeritus at Yale University. He received his PhD from Harvard University in 1972. His most recent books are The Invention of Judaism, Torah, and Jewish Identity from Deuteronomy to Paul in 2017, and What Are the Biblical Values, Yale 2019. He serves as general editor of the Anchor Yale Bible and Anchor Yale Bible Reference Library. He has been president of the Catholic Biblical Association and of the Society of Biblical Literature, and is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He holds honorary degrees from the University College Dublin and the University of Zurich. He speaks to us on the place of apocalypticism in the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Good to be with you all, even virtually. Sorry I cannot be with you. In his classic monograph, The Ancient Library of Qumran and Modern Biblical Cross declared that it proved to be an apocalyptic community, Heilsgemeinschaft, imitating the ancient sojourn of Mosaic times in anticipation of the dawning kingdom of God. Now, Cross wrote that, published in 1958. A lot of ink has been spilled, both scenes and the scrolls and apocalypticism in the intervening years. And so the question is, does this after this time? First of all, what do we mean by apocalypticism? I use the term here to refer to a kind of writing, but also a view of the world that appears in Judaism in the 2nd century BCE, in the books of Enoch and Daniel. Daniel and Enoch share some important features that may reasonably be taken to constitute a novel view. Both relied on revelations given to them by angels. Now, that in the prophets, you get more emphasis in these books, otherworldly character of the revelation, especially true in the Enoch literature. Both envisioned a long sweep history, divided into periods, with the pre-duration and culminating in divine intervention. Both imagined angelic and powers at work in history. Crucially, both expected a judgment of death and an afterlife with the angels for the righteous. Now, this cluster of motives may reasonably be said to constitute a view which was in sharp contrast to the tradition for long life in the land. But differences between Daniel and Enoch. Enoch was said to have made a round trip to heaven, being given a tour of places normally inaccessible to beings. A whole section of Enoch is concerned with the movements of the stars. There's no hint of such cosmological interest in Daniel, and so it is unlikely that all these books came from the same movement. Neither Daniel nor Enoch the Torah of Moses. They were not necessarily opposed to it. Both depended on a higher revelation. In the case of Enoch, that revelation was older than Moses, and that of Moses, and apparently took precedence over it. Now, when Cross wrote, he had a hypothesis of the scrolls was that it had to dispute over the high priesthood. The high priestly line of the Oneids had Antiochus IV Epiphanes. The office was taken over by the Maccabees. Maccabees refer to a group of people called the Hasidim or the Pious. And some people, the that these were the people responsible for these apocalyptic books. The hypothesis that the dispute had to do with the high priesthood, in part on frequent references to the sons of Zadok, the Qumran rule books, is taken to refer to the traditional priestly line, and partly on allusions to a conflict between the sectarian teacher and a figure called the priest, who was often identified with the Maccabee, although Cross preferred Jonathan's older brother Simon. But the son of Zadok is explained in the Damascus allusion to Ezekiel 44, appropriated a symbolic name for the chosen of Israel at the end of days, and it isn't necessarily a claim of genealogy at all. The wicked priest appears in biblical commentaries that Alex talked about, depicted as wicked in many respects. He is never said to be illegitimate. When the text called for QMMT, some of the works of the law, with the public in the 1980s, it learned that the origin of the sect did not lie in a dispute about the priesthood, but in disputes about the exact interpretation of the law, as matters of purity and the calendar, and this, in fact, should have been obvious already, I think, from the Damascus document. Gabriele Boccaccini had argued at length that the people who produced literature were the parent group in which the sect developed. But Enoch literature shares of the scrolls, well, it shares of the scrolls interest in a calendar that was at variance with Jerusalem temple, but nowhere in literature do we find the kind of concern with the interpretation of the Torah that is carried out the sectarian scrolls. The importance attached to Moses and the scroll, it's extremely unlikely that the sectarian in Enochic Judaism. And as to the Hasidim, very little about them, apart from the fact that they were supporters of Judas Maccabee, and the idea that they're responsible for any of this literature is entirely true. Now, the fact remains that the books of Daniel and in multiple copies in the Dead Sea Scrolls, they seem to have influenced the sectarians in their lives. Now, where do we influence? First of all, it is now generally recognized that the scrolls include compositions that were not composed with sect. These include the biblical books, we may so call them after the day. The books of Enoch and Jubilees are thought composed before the formation of the sect. Many scholars believe that all the Aramaic writings found at Qumran were older than the formation of the sect. One may quibble of whether they're necessarily older. It is true that none of the Aramaic texts refer to a community or language that's distinctively sectarian. Now, a lot of that Aramaic literature is apocalyptic, at least in a loose sense of the word. There are several other books associated with it. A notable one is the so-called Apocalypse or Son of God text, 4246, which seems to be a lot like Daniel 7. There's a New Jerusalem text. There is also a apocalyptic text called the Apocrypha of Jeremiah that is in Hebrew. Now, it is often difficult to be sure of the genre of those texts because they're fragmentary, we don't have the beginnings, and we don't have the ends. And so it isn't clear whether these are these constitute corpus that is apocalyptic more loosely defined, lacking some of the key elements, like, for example, the resurrection and judgment at the end, or whether those things are just missing by accident and would be there if we had entire compositions. So, thing to base much on that fragmentary literature, most of which was found from before. So here I will focus just on major, well-preserved sectarian texts. The two rule books, that's the Serek, so-called community rule, and the Damascus document, the War Code, the Hodayot, and the Pesherim. Now, none of these is in the form of an apocalypse, insofar as they are accounts of revelation. All the texts of apocalypses begin by describing how they got the revelation, and you don't get that in these books. They do presuppose a revelation. Positions about the movement's place in history are laid out most clearly in the Damascus document. The column gives an overview of the history of Israel. When Israel was faithful, God delivered him up to the sword, but he around. Then in the age of wrath, 90 years after giving him over to Nebuchadnezzar, he caused a shoot of planting to sprout from Israel. These people realized their guilt and were like blind people groping away 20 years. Then God raised up the teacher to direct them in the way of his heart. Later, at the end of the Damascus, we were told that the time from the death teacher to the destruction of all his opponents will be about 40 years. The stereotypical figure of 40 years for the teacher, the total time from the exile to the end amounts to 90 years, the equivalent of the 70 weeks of years predicted in Daniel chapter 9. The reference to Daniel is not explicit in the Damascus document, but it does explicitly mention the book of the divisions of times into their jubilees, and says that God had known the exact epochs of all of them that come into being forever. The Melchizedek scroll divides into 10 jubilees. So we assume that there was a fixed dogma in history, but the idea of experience is well attested. And the characteristic ideas of the apocalyptic literature that you can view all of history separately, and that it is divided into periods so that you can figure where you are in the grand scheme of things, and this presupposes a revelation. The most important period was undoubtedly, or Acharit Yamim in Hebrew. Hebrew Bible, this expression was used to mean in the course of time, in future days. You get that already in the Pentateuch. In the prophets, it came to imply the transformation in the distant future. In Isaiah 2 and 4, the mountain house will be exalted at the end of days. In Daniel chapter, Nebuchadnezzar's dream is entirely concerned with what will happen in the end of days or future. The expression occurs more than 30 times in the Dead Sea Scrolls, including twice in the Damascus document. The Lachic metaphor QMNT declares that this is the end of days. References are found in the exegetical literature, such as the Pesherim. As Cross already noted, it is an assumption of the Pesherim that prophecy referred not to the time of its, but to the period of the end of history, which was the time of the sectarian interpreters. The end of the scrolls has two aspects. The time of testing, and it is a time of incipient salvation. He claims that this period had already begun, but some aspects of the end remain in the future, notably the coming of the Messiahs. In the Dead Sea Scrolls claims that the Messiah had already come. Messianic expectation was conspicuously absent in the early apocalypses of Enoch and Daniel. The scrolls refer quite consistently to the expectation of two Messiahs, the royal Messiah of Israel and the eschatological high priest, Messiah of Aaron. It's quite holistic about the coming of these messiahs. It is apparent that the Messiah of Israel, who is God, the branch of David and the prince of the nation, has a role in defeating the enemy of Israel, who will be delivered up in the age of visitation. He is identified as the scepter of Baal oracle, who will smite all the children of Sheth. The blessing of the prince of nation prays that he smite the people with the might of his hand, ravage the earth with his scepter, and bring death to the ungodly with the mythics. The blessing goes on to a young bull with horns of bronze. A fragment relates to the logical war 4285 is that he will kill someone, probably the king of the Kittim. He had a marginal role in the war scroll. It is written on a shield in preparation for battle, and Balaam's are decided with interpretation. The cosmic dualism that is merely alluded to in the Damascus document is laid out systematically in the treatise on the two spirits in the community rule. It begins with a veritable table of contents. For the maskil, who seems to have been an official in the community, to instruct and teach all the sons of light in the nature of all human beings, according to all the kinds of their spirits, with their signs for their works in their generations, and with regard to the visitation of their afflictions and their periods of well-being. This is followed by an account of creation, then an outline of the two spirits, then the effects of the two spirits in the world, and the ends to which they will lead. Finally, the last section describes the struggle of the two spirits for control of humanity, even within individuals. God, we are told, has set an end to the spirit of darkness, and at a foreordained time, he will destroy it forever. Then he will refine for himself some of humanity and give them all the glory of Adam. This treatise is in the form of a wisdom instruction. It is not an account of a revelation, but it evidently presupposes revealed knowledge. It resembles the apocalyptic worldview of Daniel and Enoch insofar as it gives a synoptic view of history, attributes decisive roles to superhuman spirits, promises eternal reward and punishment for individuals, and also promises that God will eventually intervene to destroy the forces of evil. Nonetheless, the idiom of the treatise is quite different from that of the apocalypses. Daniel drew on old Semitic traditions about turbulent beasts from the sea and the victory of a figure riding on the clouds. Enoch drew on old Mesopotamian traditions about rebellious angels and giants. But the treatise depicts an evenly balanced dualism of light and darkness that is part of the plan of creation. There was a precedent for cosmic dualism in another text from the scrolls for Qumran, sometimes called the Testament of Amram, an Aramaic text dated to the late 3rd or early 2nd century BCE. In one fragment, Amram recounts a vision of two angelic beings who were fighting over him. One of them ruled over darkness, and the other ruled over all of light, and Amram was invited to choose between them. We also find a balanced dualism in the war scroll from Qumran, where the opposing spirits of light and darkness are identified as Michael and Belial, each of whom prevails in turn in the eschatological war until God finally intervenes. There is no precedent for that kind of balanced dualism in the Hebrew Bible. From the early days of scholarship on the scrolls, some scholars have been struck by the analogy between the treatise on the two spirits and Zoroastrian dualism. We read in the Gathas, in the beginning, those two spirits, where the well-endowed twins were known as the one good and the other evil in thought, word, and deed. Between them the wise chose rightly, not so the fools. And when these spirits met, they established in the beginning life and death, that in the end the followers of the lie should meet with the worst existence, but the followers of truth with the best mind. Of these two spirits, he who was of the lie chose to do the worst things, while the most Holy Spirit chose truth, as did all who sought with zeal to do the pleasure of the wise Lord. The Gathas do not associate the two spirits with light and darkness, but the Greek author Plutarch, writing about 100 of the Common Era, citing Theopompus, who wrote about 300 BCE, says that Horamadzes, or Ahura Mazda, is born from the purest light, and Erimanius, or Ahriman, from darkness, and they are at war with one another. Conversely, while Plutarch does not list ethical characteristics, the ethical dualism is clear in the Gathas, and even clearer in later Persian tradition. The ethical contrast is most typically formulated in terms of truth and falsehood. Truth is also a primary value in the Dead Sea Scrolls. The opposing value is called avala, and it covers a wide range of iniquity, including injustice and deceit. We may recall that the opponent of the teacher in the Damascus document was known as the man of the lie. Many scholars resist the suggestion that an important passage of the scrolls is influenced by Persian ideas. Some of the objections are ideological or theological, strengthened by the fact that the scholar who first drew attention to the analogy, Carl Gustav Kuhn, was a Nazi. Others are troubled by the difficulty of dating the Persian sources. The days of Plutarch and Theopompus is not in doubt, but there is considerable doubt as to how accurately they represent Persian traditions. But fidelity to Persian tradition isn't the point here. No one has ever suggested that the Jewish author of the treatise wished to reproduce Persian ideas accurately, or understood them for that matter. Whether Plutarch's account was accurate or not, it is indicative of one way the Persian tradition was received in the West. In the words of Jutta Leonard Baltzar, the basic contrast of two opposing spirits related to light and darkness seems to be a concept well known to Hellenistic authors and linked to Zoroastrianism. We do not know from what sources the Jewish authors may have become aware of it. It was not necessarily derived directly from Persian sources. The Jewish author of the treatise simply wanted to find a formulation that was useful for his purpose. In classical medieval Zoroastrianism, the two spirits are coeval, uncreated beings, and this seems to be the case already in Plutarch's account. In the Gathas, on the usual interpretation, the two spirits identified as Spentamanu and Angramanu were thought to be the twin children of Ahura Mazda. In this respect, the two spirits in the community rule from Qumran resemble the Gathas more than the later development. Also, in the Gathas, people are not predetermined. They can choose between the two spirits. And this is also the case in 4Q Amram, the Aramaic apocalyptic text found at Qumran. The author of the treatise adapted the material freely. What he took from the Persian tradition was the idea of two primeval antithetical spirits symbolized by light and darkness, and the conviction that the conflict between them would ultimately be resolved in favor of the forces of light. Despite significant differences in detail, the correspondence in broad outline remains striking. The two spirits are wholly opposed to each other and do not share a single trait. Because of the prominence of the treatise in the community rule, scholars have long assumed that this was the heart of the sectarian theology. When other copies of the community rule from K4 were published, however, it became clear that 1QS was exceptional in including the treatise. The opposition of light and darkness also underlies the War Scroll, but otherwise the influence of this theology in the scrolls is hard to assess. There are some points of contact with other scrolls. The songs of the Sabbath sacrifice say that from the God of knowledge comes all that exists forever. The thanksgiving hymns refer to the spirits of man. We have already noted the opposition of Belial and the Prince of Lights in the Damascus document. But in these cases, the direction of influence is uncertain and do not require that the other documents subscribe to the full dualism of the treatise. Many scholars think that the treatise originated as an independent text, possibly outside the sectarian movement. It is striking that it never refers either to the Yachad or community, which is the main subject of 1QS, or to the Torah of Moses. Nonetheless, its place in the Serek and the correspondences with the dualism of the War Scroll shows that it was important at least to some people. The sectarian movement, like Judaism in general, was concerned more with orthopraxy, with the fulfillment of the laws, than with orthodoxy in terms of having a consistent theology. The treatise on the two spirits clearly expects reward and punishment for individuals beyond death. The children of light are promised healing and great well-being and length of days and fruitfulness of seed with everlasting blessings and joy of ages in eternal life and a crown of glory with a garment of splendor in everlasting light. Conversely, the children of darkness may expect great afflictions at the hand of all the angels of punishment for everlasting destruction by the furious avenging anger of God, for eternal terror and everlasting shame, with the disgrace of destruction in the fire of dark regions, and all their ages, all their generations will be in sorrowful mourning with no remnant or survivor. Nothing is said of resurrection at the end of history. In this, the treatise corresponds to the other sectarian scrolls. The Damascus document likewise promises the righteous all the glory of Adam, and in the case of the men of perfect holiness, that they will live 1,000 generations without mention of resurrection at the end of history. The expectations of the scrolls with regard to the afterlife have been controversial. Josephus writes of the Essenes that it is a firm belief among them that although bodies are corruptible and their matter unstable, souls are immortal and endure forever. Hippolytus, in contrast, attributes to them a belief in the resurrection of the body, but his account is confused. Granted that Josephus formulates the matter in a Greek way when he speaks of immortality of the soul, his description is easy enough to reconcile with the account of the afterlife in the treatise of the two spirits, insofar as neither one mentions bodily resurrection. The most controversial evidence on this subject is found in the thanksgiving hymns or Hodayot. In Daniel and Enoch, the righteous are promised that they will be elevated to join the angelic host after death. In the hymns, the members of the sectarian movement claim to experience this elevation already in this life. I thank you, Lord, because you saved my life from the pit, and from Sheol you have lifted me up to an everlasting height. The corrupt spirit you have purified from great sin, so that he can take his place with the host of holy ones and can enter into communion with the congregation of the sons of heaven. Now, there was a big cemetery at Qumran. They certainly were aware of death, but remarkably, they don't talk about resurrection. They seem to believe that the spirit passed directly, or the spirit of the members of the community passed directly into the fellowship with the angels. The sectarians were certainly familiar with the hope for resurrection at the end of history from the books of Enoch and Daniel, and also from some other writings preserved at Qumran, such as the Pseudo-Ezekiel text. But the community, as reflected in the Thanksgiving hymns, does not seem to have been focused on the hope of resurrection. Rather, they lived in anticipation of joining the angels in the present. The sectarian scrolls have scarcely anything to say about death. Like the Gospel of John, they seem to have believed that they had already passed from death to life. They could already anticipate the fellowship with the angels that was promised to the righteous after death, and that they believed that they could continue to enjoy this fellowship even when their earthly life had ceased. This was not immortality of the soul in the Platonic sense, but we can easily understand how it might have served as the basis for the account of Essene eschatology in Josephus. In conclusion, apocalypticism was never a single movement. It was a worldview that made certain assumptions about the way of the world, including, importantly, the unity of history, the eventual end of history, a judgment at the end of history, and a judgment that included reward for the righteous and punishment for the wicked. The sectarian movement known as the Scrolls did not come into being because of its apocalyptic beliefs. It arose because of disputes about the interpretation of the Torah in the Hasmonean era. The sectarians developed their apocalyptic worldview to explain their experience and provide answers to fundamental questions. Why was it that so many of their compatriots did not appreciate the rightness of their positions? Why did God allow this situation to continue? To answer these questions, the sectarians drew on various resources. These included the early apocalyptic works of Enoch and Daniel, but many other resources besides, including the Jewish wisdom tradition and some traditions of non-Jewish origin. They may have varied in the ways they formulated this worldview. It is not apparent that they all subscribed to the doctrine of the two spirits, but they consistently held that history conformed to a divine plan measured out in periods. That plan mysteriously allowed for evil, personified by Belial, the angel of darkness, to prevail for a time. But it would not prevail forever. They awaited divine intervention to set things right, but they did not doubt that it would come. Eventually, when the Messiahs came, their interpretation of the Torah would prevail and would be observed by all Israel. They also expected a final war in which the Gentile powers would be defeated, but they are elliptic about the course of events at the end of history. Like the apocalypses, the sectarians expected rewards for the righteous and punishment for the wicked beyond this life. Unlike the apocalypses, however, they believed they could already share in fellowship with the heavenly hosts in their community life. Their eschatology, in short, was realized to some degree in the present, although there was a greater fulfillment to come. Frank Cross's claim that the sectarians, most probably Essenes, were an apocalyptic community has held up pretty well over the last 50 years, but it needs some qualifications. Apocalypticism provided a theological frame for the sect. It did not determine their specific commitments to the Torah as they understood it, and Cross, I should add, was well aware of that. But the sectarians also rang changes on the apocalyptic worldview and adapted it to provide a theology that was distinctive and specific to their own movement. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Collins, for joining us via Zoom. This is Doug Clark. I don't know who you can see or what you can see, but but
See you, but I can hear you.
yes, and it's unfortunate that you were unable to come, but we are so appreciative that you did this via Zoom and introduced us to this, not just the world of apocalypticism, but the world of Qumran and its apocalypticism. I thought that was extremely helpful. We have a few minutes for a panel to assemble on these chairs over here. We'll have some internal discussion, so stay with us, John, if you would, and we will have some discussion. I'm sure we'll have some questions for you. So if we could have the presenters who are here, and I think Emmanuel Tove, you are here somewhere. Okay, do you want to come? Are you planning to come up to the panel? Okay. And then we have a couple of other guests. So we have met and heard from 3 of the individuals here. Thank you for joining us, Professor Tove and Professor White Crawford and Professor Jason. See, I did pronounce it correctly. I've got that. We have 2 new individuals here, and I want you to introduce yourselves. And then I'm going to say something about you too, but if you would, introduce yourselves and your interest in Dead Sea Scrolls and so on. So please.
Well, it is wonderful to be here.
Yes.
My name is Luis Gustavo Assis. I am originally from Brazil, but now a denizen of the beautiful state of California since last year. And I'm currently a PhD candidate at Boston College. I know my geography. I know that I'm not in Massachusetts now, but that's the place of my residence. And so I was thinking about this program since yesterday. I think I'm a grandson, somehow a grandson of Frank Cross, because a Brazilian grandson. 2 of my teachers were students of Cross. David Vanderhooft at Boston College was a student of the last seminary of epigraphy that Frank Cross taught at Harvard, and the other teacher that I had, a major one in my education, was John Monson from Trinity International University. So I feel somehow related to Cross. He was your doctor father, right? So you are probably my aunt. What is the familiar degree of relationship here? But anyway, so I'm currently writing my dissertation on, not on the Dead Sea Scrolls, unfortunately, but it's on Ezekiel, the schoolboy of the Hebrew Bible.
That's not unfortunate.
I know.
Because I did work on Ezekiel, so yeah. Good for you. Okay, and Matt.
It's wonderful to be here. My name is Matthew Cortman. I'm an adjunct professor here at La Sierra, and I did my undergraduate studies here at the Divinity School. And I had the privilege of doing my master's studies under Dr. Collins at Yale Divinity School. And I'm currently doing a PhD in New Testament at the University of Birmingham, looking at how early Christians interpreted parables. But I've always been such a fan of the scholarship that is here, Dead Sea Scrolls in particular. So yes, it's just a wonderful opportunity to have this whole weekend presentation and the remarkable amount of knowledge that's been shared here during this weekend.
So I would like to begin with a question, a very general one, and we will talk among ourselves, and John, who was here a minute ago, can join in this as well. And this is a kind of a general impression of, or questions about what we've done this weekend. I think, have you both been here for Saturday too? Were you here both? Okay. So did anything come out of the presentations on Saturday or today that strikes you as interesting or worthy of further debate or of particular value as you're doing your work in your particular area? We have some archaeologists and some text people. So just in general, what kinds of things?
I mean, it was beautiful to hear yesterday the engagement of the audience, the idea of Jody Magnus about Qumran being a place of the sacrifices and the animal bones being the evidence for that, her interpretation. And I want to tie it up with something that you mentioned today about the Temple Scroll as this God speaking in first person through the text. And so, I mean, the architecture is missing for a sacred space in Qumran, but this whole idea of Second Temple Judaism of scribal divination, and you have God himself speaking through a text, is that enough for, let's say, a liturgical, quasi-religious activity, quasi-ritualistic activity by the members of the community?
Well, I think that That's a hard question. I'm thinking it out. I think that we don't have evidence in the scrolls themselves that point to the community at Qumran performing sacrifice. We only have, in a sense, negative evidence that they considered the temple polluted in some way, and the cult was flawed. So did that cause them to perform sacrifice at Qumran? When I think that Jody's evidence about the animal bones is very compelling, especially when you look at the comparative evidence from other cult sites. I don't find her interpretation of an altar site particularly compelling. And I would also like to find at Qumran, which we don't, other sacrificial implements, like an incense burner. However, the idea that they were performing, that those bones are the remnants of sacrifices, make a lot better sense than that they're just ritual meals, because so were they conducting occasional sacrifices, say when they had their renewal of the covenant ceremony? There's certainly not, this isn't a major temple site where they're reenacting the rituals of the Jerusalem temple, or even the temple at Leontopolis, where they would have had daily sacrifices. That's not what's going on there. So but I don't think the texts enlighten us as to what they were doing there. So it's a difficulty. But I actually do think that given her evidence that, yes, there was some kind of sacrificial activity going on.
And the divine presence in the form of a text, of favoring that practice.
No, I'm not sure about that, because I think that, for example, the temple scroll, we know that 11Q Temple A, at least, was brought into Qumran. And we don't know the status of the temple scroll for the community there or the wider Essene movement. We only have 4 copies of it. 3 are from Cave 11. The 4Q copy is perhaps, it's not clear that it was a full copy of what we get from Cave 11Q. So what they actually thought of the text, I think, is not as clear as we would like it to be. Certainly, the redactor of the temple scroll wanted us to think it was authoritative because it's speaking in the voice of God. But whether they did or not, I don't think is clear at all.
Now, Professor Tovde, you had a question, comment.
I have a question and a remark to Alex. I listened with much interest and amazement to your overall talk, and we now hear that this is a summary of your book. So we all look forward to the forthcoming of that book, and that's very soon, right?
Well, this is not from, there's a different book on religious violence that's forthcoming. This is from various other projects about biblical interpretation.
Okay.
But maybe it's a good project for a next book.
Yes.
We gotta have a next project ready to go.
So I listened to your review of the processes of the interpretation of the Bible. And you mentioned so much. I don't know whether you also mention, and this is an ongoing business. I don't know whether you also mentioned that this, well, you know everything that I say, that this started within the Bible itself. So I don't have to go into detail in which books it started, etc. But it's very important to stress that matter. So it started from within the Bible. And Bible is a big word, as we heard from Sydney. So it started within the certain books of the Bible, and then, of course, you focused on compositions after the Bible. But you did mention also the scribes. And this is basically the focus of my question. I don't know, from my point of view, whether you emphasized sufficiently the tasks of the scribes in this process of interpretation. And you know everything that I'm saying, but I don't know whether you emphasize this sufficiently. And basically the problem, if I can say in a few words, is on the one hand, the issue of interpretation, and on the other hand, the writing of the scribes. And there is a tension between those two poles, and they all have much in common. And you know these things. But I think they get a little bit blurred in your expose. And you tend to explain too much, from my point of view, you tend to explain too much to the corner of biblical interpretation. What do I mean? A scribe has in front of him a text, and some scribes produce the text that they have in front of them more or less literally, and other scribes insert in the text they produce all kinds of elements of interpretation, so they do it already themselves. So everything we see is a product of interpretation. In all the scribes, or most of the scribes that we see in front of us in Qumran, not so much in the other places in the Judean desert, not in Masada, because they are the Proto-Masoretic text, not in Nachal Hever, because they are the Proto-Masoretic text. Now, then we get to your examples. You give the example of Psalm 145, the verse Ne'eman. It starts with the noon verse, Ne'eman. And you give this as an example of the flow of interpretation, and you brush aside the other possibility of this being a textual matter. And then you come to the very large example of the Nachash pericope. And that's when I had to leave, so I didn't hear you exactly, but I know what you were going to say. This is a matter of interpretation, and you're not the only one. My colleague, Alexander Offey, called this Midrash, and Alexander Offey called this Samuel scroll, not the Samuel scroll. He calls this 4Q Midrash Samuel. I mean, God forbid, this is not Midrash Samuel. This is really a Samuel scroll. But you go along with that example. And you can take many more examples. So in my view, on the whole, I'm afraid in your wish to explain the role of the biblical interpretation, you minimize the role of the textual transmission and the scribes. And there is no right or wrong. It's a matter of putting the evidence a little bit more on this side and a little bit more on that side.
I think I agree with everything you were saying. I think you just gave me, I could answer this in the version of a book right now. because there's a lot to say about it. So I'll limit myself to just a couple of remarks. First, I 100% agree with everything you were saying. And maybe the couple of things I want to mention is, in some ways, I think of interpretation as happening alongside authorship, alongside editorial work, and alongside redaction. There's always, every author is in some ways an interpreter. And this is, you can see this in Emmanuel, you mentioned this in the biblical text. There are these references, in Genesis, it says Bethel, which as, Luz or something like that. We have all these examples where there's, whether this is a later editor or whether it's the same author, there are these layers of engagement with a prior text. And, we were talking about the Temple Scroll a moment ago. The Temple Scroll does to Deuteronomy what Deuteronomy does to earlier biblical text. So this is an explicit form of interpretation using a version of rewriting, and this is something that the scholar Morton Smith wrote an article about way back in the 70s. It gets forgotten, and he pointed this out. This is the process we think about as happening in the Second Temple period. It's started way back, and I think that's what you were saying as well. And then kind of the other big issue you raised, I don't know. I think it's a little more of, we could probably, all of us could sit down and try to decide kind of the technical matter, or whether we want to take, let's say, the Nun verse in the Psalm scroll as an editorial scribal addition or a textual variant. Part of what I was trying to convey is that a textual variant and a scribal addition are in many ways, there's kind of a blurred boundary between the two of them. And I think we could do the flip side in the sense that Sydney mentioned the example of Deuteronomy 32:8, where I do think it's pretty clear that the example from the Deuteronomy scroll from Qumran and the Septuagint is the original with all its appropriate scare quotes, and that the Masoretic text has created the scribal, the change. So these are textual variants in the sense that they reflect different snapshots of the biblical text, but there, I think we're on pretty solid footing with the reverse direction. The example of the Psalm scroll, and the reason why I think in this case of the Psalm scroll, the Psalm 145 example, and 1 Samuel 11, the reason why I think that those are scribal additions, the scribe had a text, just like you described, they had a text in front of them, the scribe of the Psalm scroll, or at least the scribe of the whatever the Psalm scroll is copying from, had a copy of Psalm 145 missing the Nun verse, and felt that there was something wrong with that, and went in and fixed it. Now, that's a variant, because it's a snapshot of the text of Psalms. The reason I think that is the case is, it's such a clean, it's so good. And in fact, some of the language draws from later in Psalm 145. So I'm not wedded to that argument. I could be persuaded otherwise. And same thing with the passage in 1 Samuel 11. It just so easily fixes all the problems. It looks like somebody went in there and had the text that we're familiar with from the MT and went in there and kind of fixed it up with those additions. I still think that's a variant. I just think a variant can be a representation of scribal activity. So I think in some ways we're closer than initially anticipated.
Okay,
yes.
Good, thank you. I think that this conversation could go on over stuffed dates and tea in the Bedouin tent. So if just for time's sake, thank you. But I mean, you raised, that was such an important issue, and I appreciate the conversation back and forth, which really clarifies the issue and the challenge of determining where this weight lies. So, Matt, please.
So I know you were thinking that it should continue in the Bedouin tent, but actually one of the questions that I had was actually related directly to that first question, but I had a thought that I wanted to ask you, Dr. Jason, about what you would think about this. So in some sense, I wonder if the situation of finding, we're caught between these two options. Is it too perfect because a scribe has gone ahead and added this in because they saw the deformed text, or not the deformed text, but the perceived problem? Or is it the case that it looks too perfect precisely because it's the missing piece that was part of a deformed text? And so between those two options, though, I can't help but think of like a bit of the situation with ex eventu prophecy, where any actually perfect prophecy in the Bible, if there was such a one, could never be proven, because how would you disprove the hypothesis that it had been edited later, just based on the text alone? Versus ex eventu prophecies, where you obviously can date it because it's incorrect. There's a part of the text in which it's broken, and now you know exactly where the individual must have been writing it. So I wonder, to a certain degree, without earlier manuscript information, if these kind of textual discussions can't help but be somewhat subjective, just based on the nature of the kind of evidence we're looking at. Do you think there's really any way to objectively decide between those options?
I would say unequivocally no. There's no objective way. One of my first introductions to text criticism was actually not in biblical studies, but a scholar of classical text criticism. He introduced us to Hausmann and all of this work that's done in classical literature. And he basically said Hausmann's great theory was you just kind of go with your gut a little bit. And sometimes that's kind of what we do. And, oftentimes that changes a little bit. So, maybe 10 years ago, if I was giving a version of this talk, I would have introduced the Samuel example and the Psalm 145 example as textual variants. But I think part of what I'm trying to kind of push for is that it doesn't have to be a binary. Scholars we like to try to get nuance in the situation. It's not this or that, but maybe just trying to complicate the entire process of not seeing something as either biblical interpretation or a scribal variant, but actually it's maybe some sort of I'm trying to think of what the right kind of visual representation, the kind of circle that's kind of constantly going around itself. Scribes, authors, interpreters are oftentimes one and the same.
Let's then take a minute. Any questions in the audience here? We have one over here.
Thank you for your presentations. I have a question for you, Cindy or Alex. What makes a text more authoritative, or what gives a text more acceptance among the community? Is it related to the method or something else? And then for John Collins, what about the pseudo-Ezekiel and the interpretation of the vision of the dry bones? How does it fit in your apocalyptic view? Thank you.
First.
Well, I think that one of the things that clearly made a text authoritative was its perceived age. That what I've called the classical literature of ancient Israel, that is perceived to have come down from the time of the kingdoms, is clearly carries authority as such. And Enoch carries authority because it's from Enoch, and that's pre-Diluvian. And so I think that age is clearly perceived age or actual age is one of those things. And then I also think so that by the time we get to Qumran, or the wider movement of which Qumran is a part, in the 1st century BCE and then the 1st century CE, you have several centuries of literature prior to that they're working with. But then other things that make a text authoritative is it is circular, right? Does it agree with my worldview? Well, if it does, then it has authority, and if it doesn't, well, forget it. So I think that in some cases, and I keep mentioning the Temple Scroll, I think in some cases it's difficult to tell whether a text had authority in the Qumran movement or not. And I think that one of the things that happened with because of the order of discovery is, those nice whole scrolls, and other people have pointed this out, I'm not the first. The nice whole scrolls got a lot of attention. And so, for example, with the Genesis Apocryphon, scholars would say, oh, well, this is, their understanding of Genesis. And I remember Moshe Bernstein got up in a meeting once and said, well, what if it was just for fun? And everybody went, huh? For fun? and I think he was right. I mean, I think that there were all kinds of reasons that they were writing this literature. And, you know, it wasn't all because it was religious, right? So that's sort of a partial answer, and maybe you would like to say something?
I would say the only thing I would add to that is that, like all the things we've been saying, everything is fluid. So something we can kind of point to is like the examples of Daniel, and you know, we all can maybe correct me if I'm mistaken in my data, but it seems that the copying of Daniel kind of seems to kind of tick up as you get closer to, let's say, the 1st century CE, because Daniel becomes, as Sydney was saying, it connects more with their worldview, right? They're starting to feel the agitation towards, you know, the antagonism with the imperial context. So Daniel, which is a relatively young text, actually becomes a little bit more of a bestseller because the kind of context allows that. And even something like Enoch seems to decrease in copies as the centuries go on, so it seems to lose its. Now, it doesn't mean eventually it will fall out, you know, but not in Qumran. So that's the other thing is you know, there's a complete lack of stability here. Things can be shifting. The text can shift. You know, we don't have 2 covers of a Bible here where everything's in or out. There's just a lot more kind of fluidity, and that closes in the 1st and 2nd century, though.
Yeah. John Collins had a question about Ezekiel.
About pseudo-Ezekiel, so-called. Well, you know, I would think that this is part of the broader literature that happens to be found at Qumran. I don't see it as a sectarian text in itself. As to whether it's apocalyptic, you know, it has one motif that one might well find, especially in the later apocalypses, but there isn't enough of it, you know, to say what's the understanding, say, of history in this text. There just isn't enough of it. So, you know, it's relevant to a discussion of apocalypticism in the Dead Sea Scrolls, but not very decisive of anything, and I don't think it tells us anything necessarily about the particularly sectarian beliefs.
Okay, thank you. And I think it's about time we need to close. Is there one more question here? Okay, Dawn, please.
This is from online, but it also kind of follows up on what Alex was just talking about. When you say the fluidity of the text, I guess, so the question is, how reliable are the biblical scrolls that we've found to, or how can we trust them? What's the reliability of these scrolls for the originals? And then when we're talking about fluidity as far as relating to the contemporary context, is that more the Pesharim or, yeah?
I'll start. I think that one of the things that we need to understand is we don't have the originals, and we're not going to have the originals. So that the work that text critics do is to try and reach back as far in the manuscript tradition as we can. And so one of the things that we discovered with the Qumran manuscripts is that I said that the text was not fixed. It was still, and I use the word fluid because there still was variety in it. Having said that, I think as scholars, we tend to emphasize the variety. We want people to see that and to understand it. But among our various, among the manuscripts that we have, and among especially the Masoretic texts, the Septuagint and the Samaritan Pentateuch, there is a great deal of stability in these texts. For example, the text that I've worked on the most, Deuteronomy, yes, there is variation, and I showed you an example of it, but there also, the text of Deuteronomy, I think, was relatively stable. So that our emphasis is, well, yes, there was fluidity, but with it's sort of, there's fluidity within boundaries. so that I think that people don't need to be worried about the kind of whether we can trust the text or not. I think we can trust the text, even with the knowledge that we have now.
I think also some of the, I once got a version of this question, which is basically, did we get anything wrong? And the answer, no, of course, none of these texts suggest that there are multiple deities that the ancient Israelites believed, but we did hear about the fact that there was this belief and there were kind of multiple kind of demigods, the B'nai Elohim. But I think some of this also comes back to, some of the work that we've described is seeing where these religious traditions kind of developed over time. None of this takes away from the Masoretic text, which becomes the traditional, the text that's the foundation of medieval and modern Judaism. Nothing changes that. That is the sacred text of Judaism. The translations of the Masoretic text are foundational. They're found in synagogues and churches and libraries. And none of what we're talking about, undercuts that. Nobody's, faith disappears because we have a variant in a Qumran scroll. I think actually it enhances it, and it becomes, you have a better understanding of where these texts came from, allows you to have a greater connection with your own kind of faith tradition. So.
I think we need to draw this to a close. Thank you, and thank you, John Collins, for joining us from in the Far East. Appreciate that immensely. Yeah, you're getting some waves here from some of the panelists. So, and I just have to say how much we've appreciated all of the presenters, panelists for the sessions we've had this weekend. It has enriched us all. We are deeply appreciative. And appreciative to all of you for coming and joining us, whether in person or online. And look forward to our next installment a year from now.